and shut up, you bunch of Kayfabe!
My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
This is the Kayfabe Weekly Shoot for the weekend of
February 8th.
I believe it was February 6th of 1994.
Yes.
Where we lost Jack the King Kirby, man. And I just was curious, do you remember where you were when you first discovered that we lost the king?
I don't remember it clearly. I believe it was in Wizard. You know, they would have like a news item, you know, an obituary. That's probably where I saw it.
When I was a little dude, at that point I was definitely into comics enough to know names and who created who and who the important people were and all that kind of a thing. And it became my goal to shake that man's hand when I was a young boy. And it was an era where Chap Yap is 19 years old and he's a professional cartoonist. I was just 12. Not that much of a disparity. It could have been
Right.
could have been possible. And I knew that the Kubert brothers were professional letterers by age 13. So I was like really driven. I didn't know about nepotism. I was watching an episode of the X-Men cartoon on Fox, and at the end of that, rest in peace, you know, in memory of Jack the King Kirby, 1917 or 1919.
It may have been on something like MTV News.
Rest in peace, Jack the King. There's not a day that goes by where I don't think of the man.
We want to thank Jay McQuarns for the intro animation that plays before these videos.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic. I certainly couldn't do it on my own, so thanks, Jay McQuarns.
Yeah, it was a much-needed contribution to the Kayfabe channel. And once again, just like the great JFK said, man, ask not what Cartoonist Kayfabe can do for you, but ask what you can do for Cartoonist Kayfabe. And if you do something fly like that, man, we'll be happy to send you a bunch of cool, free signed shit. Some fun controversy, or if you're a listener from across the pond, controversy regarding the Image Eye logo showed up on Twitter earlier this week, man. Pretty fun stuff. Never crossed my mind to tweet Hank Canals to see. I always like how whenever I say his name, there's this like seeming disdain in the back of my throat that comes out, but there's really not. I never thought to tweet at Hank Canals to ask if he was the guy who created the Image Eye logo. I read it from I believe an Eric Larson editorial or something in the letters pages before, and somebody did, a Kayfaber did ask Hank, and Hank confirmed it. But when you look at it, he confirmed it with plausible deniability because the guy asked if he created the logo, and Canal's response was, long time ago. So he didn't say yes or no. He kind of left it open to interpretation. We posted on the Instagram that mystery was solved. I received a text from Rob Liefeld. It was like, no way, 1,000%, like I created the thing with witnesses, he said. And then in the comment section, Dan Fraga posted that, yeah, like Rob was the guy. This is the kind of stuff that gets unearthed on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel. You get a chance to read any cool comics this week?
I read Domu this week.
Did you?
I should say I reread Domu this week. I plan to reread it again. We're in the middle of this Akira overview and looking at the works that led up to that. So had some free time, had a digital copy of it, and was excited to go through it again. Don't want to get too much into that. You know, we'll certainly be talking about that in the coming weeks. But as everybody knows, I think anyone who's read that work, it's a substantial work. It might be a tighter work than Akira. So very rewarding to reread. I'm planning to reread it again in print this week. So that was my good comics reading of the week.
One of the things that we should say is that because Jim took the trip to the Angoulême Comic Festival in France a couple weeks back, our Wizard magazine coverage is going to be preempted by our new Making a Masterpiece show for this one Monday, where we're going to be kind of delving deep into Katsuhiro Otomo's work. Here's a trailer of that. My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And I'm Tom Scholey.
We could assume that a cartoonist masterpiece is rarely their freshman effort. There are a few examples where you can point to that creator's work and you could draw direct lines to that masterpiece by way of their earlier work. And I think we have that here clearly with Katsuhiro Otomo. He did two big pieces of work right before this that led up to Akira. The first one being the manga that we'll be talking about in this episode, Fireball. What we plan on doing It's going through Katsuhiro Otomo's early efforts leading up to Akira.
So, beyond the military and government distrust is the telekinesis, the psychic power.
The psychic warrior of Fireball happens to be a SWAT member.
The city is this exotic place where adventures do take place. I think the computer is an amazing villain. So that's a difference, right, between Akira and this story. What about you, Ed? Any comics reading this week?
Yeah, I reread a bunch of crime suspense stories. My schedule just bogged me down way too much. I have a tighter deadline on the 2 books that I'm working on that is far tighter than I thought. And I was going to write a foreword for a Dark Horse hardcover collection of crime suspense stories, but I just can't do it. I can't fit it into my schedule. But it did give me the opportunity to go ahead and read the last, say, 7 or 8 issues of the series. Fantastic, man. Probably it's some of the last Johnny Craig stuff.
I love Johnny Craig.
I do too. But he goes away pretty early in that run. But there's no reason to cry or worry because enter Reed Crandall and Bernie Krigstein. And it's Bernie
Krigstein.
It's Bernie Krigstein doing his early kind of woodshedding of cutting up the panels and adding pacing to his narratives, the stuff that will lead up to his crowning achievement of Master Race from Impact Comics that'll come about a year or 2 later. But he's setting the cornerstones for that story in the pages of Crime Suspense Stories. So whenever that volume comes out, it's definitely worth picking up. It's going to be a Dark Horse book, but it also has the last Johnny Craig story. All of those comics, even the horror books, they're all the same story. It's like the same themes explored, just in kind of slightly different angles. And Johnny Craig, he got to write his own stories. He wrote his own crime suspense stories. It wasn't L. Feldstein, and he all of his stories were like, you know, Cain and Abel kind of tales. He eventually, like, his final story is the culmination of all that he's put together, like by telling the same story over and over again. The story, it's you're following 2 couples, so it's almost like 2 comics going on at once, but then they intersect, and then they go off again, and then they intersect again with, like, perfect ending, man. I don't want to spoil it for anybody out there.
I'll probably reread that this week.
Also, just while I've been working, listening to the audiobook of Moby Dick.
Yes.
Did you ever read that thing when you were a kid? It's a big book.
I have not read it. When I was a kid, there was an illustrated version, you know, like the kids' version that I would find in the library and get out over and over, because Moby Dick was essentially a monster, and I loved, you know, all monster stories. And I love that book. That's one that I've actually thought about tracking down now as an adult, because it was something that I really looked at in my formative years. But I'm very familiar with Moby Dick, and I'm curious to talk a little bit about that. So go ahead.
Yeah, there's not too much to talk about right now, because I'm only on chapter 48.
Okay.
Which of I think 200 something.
Right.
Captain Ahab gets introduced in like chapter 28. but of course, everything that you've ever heard about it being like the crowning achievement of like American literature and the great American epic, all of that stuff. Absolutely, you're dealing with religion. You're dealing with the class system of early 1800s America. The idea of whaling. It's almost like Herman Melville sort of saw the internet coming, because a lot of people when they put information out there, there'll be like a disclaimer paragraph where they're kind of hedging their bets to explain themselves, because they're sort of imagining the anonymous comments that are going to be coming in. They're foreseeing a problem that's not there yet. So there's a whole chapter about like why whaling.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And just talking about the virtues of whaling, the importance of whaling, the excitement of whaling. And I thought that was just fucking genius, because I could imagine people like, books this big, do I really want to read about whaling that much? And when he starts to get into it, it really excites you about it.
I like that. I like sort of the technical, this was a trade, and these are the details of that trade. I find that stuff, it's procedural. I often find that really interesting, and some of the stuff that I like about Moby Dick, what I'm familiar with, is that procedural aspect. I don't know if you've gotten into any parts yet where they're like killing whales and then sharks are around.
Yeah, not quite yet.
There is some of the description of sharks is pretty insane, because when they're killing the whales, this is a giant animal. There's a lot of blood. Sharks feed off of that, frenzy off of that. And as they're like sort of trying to keep the sharks away and harvesting this whale, sharks will end up injured. And there's a description at one point of a shark where it's like its entrails are coming out and it's like chasing itself. Like imagine like a crazy dog or a cat or something chasing its tail, except it's literally a shark eating itself, in this like blood churn side. I also think of like for whaling is the Captain Easy reprints in the Smithsonian big book of newspaper reprints, one of the all-time great comic books.
Absolutely.
They have a sequence in there of harvesting whales. And I always think of that because it's like next to the ship and it's tied in and they're like cutting layers off of it and stuff. And it's that same kind of procedural aspect where it's like, this is matter of fact, this is a day, this is somebody's job, this is how you do it. And it's so far removed from my experience, it feels like that's Lord of the Rings, except it wasn't. Like that was a blue collar job.
Real life guys, one of the most sort of unbelievable things that I picked up from the book, and it made me question my reading comprehension, so I did some extra reading online, and it was like, no, these guys would live on a boat for 3 years. Years. And I'm not talking about like away from home for 3 years, and then they dock here, and then they have like a bed to sleep in. No. They're like on an island of a boat. Well, they call it a ship for 3 years. I don't know what that means, man.
Man, if you ever get a chance to see, those ships around where it's like a museum or you can go see them, they're the tiniest thing you've ever seen, too. The other piece of Moby Dick comics tie-in is Bilson Cabbage. He did the classics illustrated in the 80s. That's a pretty stylized, it's him and his mature, like, Bilson Cabbage, what you think of as great Bilson Cabbage doing Moby Dick. So that's a pretty exciting comic book. The other comic that has Moby Dick through it is Bone. It's one of his favorite books.
That reminds me, just this past week, Image's podcast, Mirror Image, released a conversation between you and Jeff Smith. Nice hour-long talk. First off, when did you guys put that together?
I can't remember exactly. I think it was like a year ago. I know a lot of time passed and I thought they might have scrapped the idea, so it was a while. I actually re-listened to it to kind of refresh my memory, make sure I didn't say anything too stupid on it before I shared the link.
It was a good conversation. One of the things that, a couple things that I really took away from it. First off, I thought that it was really great how he sort of was kind of doe-eyed to the comics industry in a lot of ways when he started his self-publishing endeavors. He came from kind of the comic strip world. He had an animation business before he started self-publishing the comic. So he thought that comics like his sort of already were out there when they very clearly were not. And it just reminded me of like a lot of the young people who are out there these days who kind of got started making their comics when they were 20 years old, so they don't have all the baggage of growing up with Image Comics and these 70,000 comics that I'm surrounded by right here.
Yeah, I think we watched that happen because I can remember probably our generation. Everybody had a very common path. Like you fell in love with comics that you found at the newsstand, and maybe you progressed to the direct market. But it was superheroes, possibly Archie, but pretty similar. Like we all read Spider-Man or whatever. And I can remember whenever that started to happen, like manga hit bookshops, original graphic novels were a thing, webcomics were a thing, and it was like, man, this next generation won't, they're coming in from all sorts of entry points. It's amazing. I'm jealous of them a little bit, but it does, like, I think what you see now in comics is a direct result of whenever that pathway broadened, when it was no longer like this is the one route into comics. And weirdly, Jeff Smith is a very, very early guy because of, that comes that way because his background was not just comics and always comics.
The other thing with just the internet in existence so that a young person could have any of their curiosity about this artist or that artist kind of satiated with like the click of a couple of buttons is really amazing. And another thing in the conversation you guys had that really spoke to me was the part where he's talking about how he feels like he's living in a dream world now, where he as a kid kind of fantasized about being able to own a book that had all of Walt Kelly's Pogo strips, or he specifically mentioned Terry and the Pirates. And if you look right over there, there's all the Terry and the Pirates right next to all the Carl Barks Duck comics. There above all the Prince Valiant, Hal Foster books, and the EC Cigar Peanuts. Every Dick Tracy strip. Like, Dick Tracy was the one for me where I was like insane about like wanting to get my hands on and read all of Chester Gould's work. Like, for whatever reason, he's like the one cartoonist that I can't be critical of whatsoever. I read his stuff for pure entertainment, and I will buy whatever he's selling, man. Like, okay, yeah, sure. Like, in this world, that this happens or that happens, totally down with that, man.
That's so nice. It's so good to have that.
I absolutely, especially like we're behind the curtain and we see how the sausage is made and any other platitude or cliche that fits with that, man. But that is like the one strip where it's an event comic for me. Whenever the new one comes out, no comics are getting drawn that day, man. So this brings up a couple questions that I have. Is there anything that we missed out on in the conversation that might have hit the cutting room floor? And two, can you name a couple of book or two that would fit in sort of your mind that you were sort of excited about that eventually sort of came to fruition? Doesn't need to be relegated to just comic strips.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not aware of anything that was cut out. I didn't edit that podcast, but re-listening to it, I think it was pretty much as is. Sean Edgar's the guy behind that at Image. He may have come on to tell us, wrap it up, or it's been an hour or something, but there was definitely no major editing, nothing I remember missing whenever I re-listened to it. Books that I was looking forward to, one of the first books I ever bought at Copacetic Comics, or one of the local shops here, is the Smithsonian newspaper comics collection from the late 70s, I think is when it came out, early 80s. But it's a big oversized book, and it's, comics from the first half of the 20th century, like best of. Like if you've heard of it, it's probably in there in some form. And so when I got hold of that book, it was before kind of this renaissance of everything being available and reprinted. And I spent like 5 years with that thing next to the bed. That was that really recalibrated my comics.
Let me
in
ask
a lot
you,
of ways.
Name 5 strips that are in there.
Captain Easy, Dick Tracy Sundays, Crazy Cat, Gasoline Alley. I can't remember if Polly and her pals are in there or not, but I think they are. I think that's probably the first time I saw Polly and her pals.
That's a good blend.
Yeah, I mean, like everything's virtually in there. Kinder Kids. Is that
Cats and Jammer Kids?
Cats and Jammer Kids? It's the German artist.
Yeah, Rudolf Dirks.
Yes, that stuff's phenomenal, mind-blowing.
Every strip ends with child abuse. The kids with their pants down and getting their asses spanked by the old Hausfrau.
Yes, so yeah, I mean, I've been excited for most of these reprints. Carl Barks stuff, hear about it forever. You get it in bits and pieces here and there, so it's nice to have those all in one place. The Popeye stuff is phenomenal.
The Sea Hag story's in that one.
And not only is that stuff, I'm thinking of like the big Fantagraphics reprint project, like now that we're in this age where everything's available or everything's being reprinted in its complete form, the Popeye comics have been a real pleasure going through those. And not only is stuff reprinted and available, but the quality of the reprints is phenomenal. Those strips are big, they're beautiful, the reproduction's beautiful. The strips that I did see as a kid that were reprinted were often shrunk down and several generations removed from, a high quality copy. And you made do with those. You can still kind of read them and get through, but the reprints now are just phenomenal. So almost any of the strips that you hear about, any of the legendary strips, all the Peanuts stuff. I remember whenever Fantagraphics started reprinting those, kind of a revelation. Actually, just sitting down and reading, several pages of those a night was a good way to wrap up the day.
There's a complete Calvin and Hobbes right there, and I think a Kayfaber sent a question in about like our thoughts on Calvin and Hobbes. Man, did any thoughts congeal in your mind when they posed that question?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways to look at Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson. Obviously, master cartoonist, super fun. His stuff is kids, like I think of it compared to Peanuts, where Peanuts is essentially adults masquerading as children. Watterson, it's kids, and that's remarkable, like I think that's the real heart of that comic. The flip side, of course, from a kayfabe point of view, is the cartoonist behind the comics, and I think that's almost equally interesting, the way he just refused to really exploit and license Calvin and Hobbes and stepped away after 10 years or so.
Solid 10-year run.
Those qualities are rare. As great as that comic is, there are a lot of great comics throughout comics history. That idea of like, these are, I'm stepping away while it's at a high level and I'm not just exploiting it for all it's worth. Those are unusual choices. So those are things I think about when I think about Calvin and Hobbes.
I think in the 60s, there was a year or two there where Charles Schulz was like the most wealthy celebrity
I can remember after he passed, and they would have like dead celebrity earnings, and he might have been the wealthiest dead celebrity too. You know, one other note on Watterson, of course, is that the Billy Ireland does have that Calvin and Hobbes art. You know, some of it's on permanent display, so anybody that visits can see some of those pages up close and personal. But it's interesting when you go on the tour and see they're like locked down and a little theatrical, but pretty fantastic.
It looks like, okay, so you're looking at a bunch of flat files that are easily accessible. You can pull stuff out and all this. And then you come to this section that is like a Clive Barker fucking Cenobite goth, like big padlock with chains and all kinds of shit, man. It's like the Nine Inch Nails section. And what's behind that? Is it Tim Vigil stuff? Is it the Joe Blow strip? Is it the Joe Blow strip where Robert Crumb has like incest and shit happening? No, it's like Calvin and Hobbes is behind that. So there's like that disparity that's extra fun, where it's just like super goth BDSM fucking setup, but it's just all the entire body of work of Calvin and Hobbes, everything that Bill Watterson put together for that damn strip. He never sold the art.
It's really great to see that stuff in person. We talked on the Comics Journal episode recently about Binky Brown being the first artist edition. There was an art show at the Billy Ireland that released a catalog that was a square-bound book of Calvin and Hobbes art that was reproduced in 4-color. You know, it must have been photographed. I don't know that it would have been scanned. You know, that's widely available. It's a paperback. It's inexpensive, but you can see his originals, you know, in 4-color glory with all their, not a lot of mistakes, but you can see them, you know, the way we look at artist editions. There is one of those for Calvin and Hobbes.
Well, we left off last week. It was your birthday. Did you get a chance to see that documentary?
I did, and I know the name of it now. Free Solo. And it refers to him solo climbing, which is no ropes, no team, just climbing mountains, cliffs, whatever you climb, rock climbing. And so it's about him free climbing El Capitan.
When you say him, do you remember the guy's
Alex
name?
Hammond.
Okay.
He was on Joe Rogan a couple months ago, I think, promoting this documentary.
I was going to say that. Like, when you brought it up, man, I was thinking, like, okay, this would be like one of the Joe Rogan guys that I would skip to, like, to see Neil deGrasse Tyson or something like that. So what's cool about this kid?
All right. One, like, I identified a lot, you're obsessive. If you're climbing this stuff and you make one mistake, you die, you're obsessive. And that comes through in the documentary. He is, he has a girlfriend in the documentary, and she's a pretty prominent character in it. And it's kind of like, they frame her in a way that's, she's great, she's fine, but they also, like, he gets hurt climbing with her. And he's like, it's the first time I've been hurt. And then he gets hurt again climbing with her. And it's like, I don't know, you know, is this a sign? Is this bad luck? So there's a little bit of, that's kind of weird. But the nice part of having a girlfriend in it is that you get to see him with these like interpersonal relationships where there's a lot of cartoonist traits. You know, he climbs, like he's climbed lots of stuff. He's the first guy to solo climb, maybe the only guy to solo climb El Capitan, but that's true of a lot of different climbs that he's done. And he doesn't tell anybody that he's doing it before he does it. He just wakes up and it's like, today's the day, and he goes and does it. And so, like, you know, they talk to his mom, they talk to his girlfriend, his dad's deceased, but, you know, they talk to people that are close to him about this, and they're like, yeah, you know, they prefer it that way. Otherwise, they would just worry, right? And what good is that? And when he finally climbs it, you see, like, the team around him, you know, you see some of them can't really watch, especially because, like, they've climbed this hundreds of times with him with ropes, you know, basically finding his route. It's not like he casually decides to climb. And whenever they finally do the climb, it's so tense. Like, I just want him to get to the top. I have problems with heights also. So there were quite a few moments in this movie where it's like, I don't know if I can look at this part. Some beautiful photography, though. You know, I assume it's drone footage and things, but it's spectacular. And it's in Yosemite, most of it, which is the best place I saw whenever I was driving around cross country. It's gorgeous. So great backdrop to it. But the obsession stuff is a big part. They also do they do an MRI at one point, and this is a really interesting moment in it. And they go through the results of the MRI, and basically they're testing him while they're you know, scanning his brain. Yeah. And afterwards they're going over the results, and they explain how his amygdala, this is where like fear shows up. This is the activity area, you know, if you're afraid, and there's no response in his brain in this area, you know, like where it should be. Like they show an average brain, and they show his brain going through this test, and you see like the activity levels like spiking and colors are showing up on the regular brain, and there's nothing on his. They also go through like a psych questionnaire, and it suggests some emotional issues. You know, at one point he's reading the questions out loud and he's like, am I depressed? And he's like, I don't know how to answer that. You know, it's good. Like, they do a nice profile on this guy, and you know, the photography is beautiful. So enjoyed it. It was good. I'd recommend it.
Awesome, man. We might as well talk about project status, man, because some of my time was down. Like, I spent like 3 days like kind of chilling, but I still got 2 pages of X-Men done and a variant cover. There's going to be another corner box variant cover to come.
I think I saw. Did you post that?
So, some of the drawings, like on an Instagram story or whatever. So I have 18 more pages of X-Men Grand Design to do, man. At most, it'll be like 9 weeks worth of work, but I would like to get at least 3 done a day. The fact that I got 2 pages done and a cover when I was down for 3 days,
that's not too bad.
Yeah, it lets me feel like I could. Plus, it was my week to Jim and I trade off our the editing sessions when it comes to our Wizard Magazine videos, and it was an editing week for me too. So that's another thing that I spent a lot of time doing while I was like in bed, which is really great. Like, I don't plan. I get sick once every 2 years, if that. But the fact that I was able to still stay productive while kind of nursing a cold.
You got to make sure you have some material on hand to edit. It's like the plane ride, captive audience, right?
That's it, man. How about you?
Yeah, my update, I did my 10 pages this week.
Congrats.
Yeah, back on track, back on schedule. I don't even know how many pages I'm doing in total. My script is numbered weird. So it brings me to something like either 85 or 87 pages done up to this point. So I have around 60 pages to go,
nice,
give or take a couple. So, you know, probably about 6 weeks to go. It's proceeding well. You know, I don't know how much I've talked about what this project is, but it's Plain Jane's. It's a young adult graphic novel. It's something that I had done over 10 years ago, 2 volumes at DC. Rights came back to us, and we always had a 3rd volume in mind. So Little Brown picked it up, and what we're doing is that 3rd volume, but we're going to package it all together in one giant 500-page book. You asked me if I was designing it, and I'm not, but I am working closely with the designer at Little Brown, so, you know, we send stuff back and forth, whether it's ideas or approving things. And the cover, I've done the whole cover, including all the lettering and stuff, so I'm not totally designing the book, but it's definitely got my stamp all over it.
You're in good hands, man. Little Brown is the publisher of the Tintin albums for the past 50 years, man.
I'm not too worried about it. They've been close. They respond when I have questions. The stuff they've given me in terms of feedback or requests makes sense. So at this point, we've been working together almost a year, and I feel pretty good about it all.
Before we get into some reader questions and stuff, can we talk about some Cartoonist Kayfabe channel format for 2 minutes, man? A lot of people have been asking if we're going to continue doing the streaming of our recording sessions, and at this point, I would say tentatively no. One of the reasons for that is because a lot of people have been confused into thinking that was
right.
our episodes.
Yes.
And that just made me feel really uncomfortable because I want to present our stuff the best way possible.
Yeah, and I think that what we will end up doing for streams and live things, it'll be a little more of an event whenever we do one. And it may be something we do monthly as something special, but it won't be, at least at this point, the regular.
Yeah, perhaps like a live Q&A session, something like that. We did come up with some structure to formats to just like add a little bit more content to the channel. My thoughts are, on Tuesdays, put out a Palmer's Picks. We'll introduce the Palmer's Picks content a week before the actual Wizard video comes out. On the last recording that we did, we were talking about the Xeric grant for a while, man, and that's going to be a good one. It's going to be in a Wizard 16 episode. Wednesdays, we just kind of started a new show and tell.
Very excited about this.
And the cool thing about the show and tell program is that it's not relegated to just one thing. Like, it's not just comics. Like, we could talk about the Leroy lettering system on an episode.
Yeah, tools.
On this coming Wednesday's show, what we're going to be talking about, when Jim was in France, I sat with Tom Scioli, and on Instagram I posted a bunch of Marvel submissions that I had when I was a teenager, and it was just saying, like, you know, thankfully I was a Marvel reject, and a lot of people were like, hey man, this stuff looks pretty good, like this looks professional enough. And I told the audience there that I would make a video and sort of cut promos on the thing, give it like a solid critique. So Tom and I are sitting down with these Daredevil pages that I drew when I was like 18, and we're sort of giving it a hard critique. Just in case you have it in your mind to submit stuff to Marvel, it'll give you some food for thought to those ends, man. So that'll come out Wednesday. Thursdays or Fridays. The weekend is generally set up for the Kayfabe Weekly Show, this program right here. And of course, the Monday episodes are sacrosanct. It's like magazine stuff. The response to our Comics Journal episodes, really huge, man. The popularity's just increased a lot. I look forward to doing some more of that stuff. And I re-listen to the episodes. The stuff we're able to talk about is just so much more rich, man. It's using more of our superpowers.
Yeah. And we should remind viewers, the first show and tell was Wrestling Comics, which is live now. So if you're watching this and you can go back and see that if you missed it.
Another question that a lot of people have been asking us, because speaking of wrestling, they're not like up on terms, man. People have been asking, guys, what the heck is a kayfabe? Do you have like a Reader's Digest soundbite for that?
Yeah, I think so. So I loved wrestling as a kid, loved it. Very similar to comics in a lot of ways that I didn't understand then. And then when podcasting came up, wrestlers started to have podcasts, and I got really into those, and it kind of rekindled my love of wrestling. And specifically, guys would talk about storytelling in the ring, and Steve Austin was a guy that would do this, and it piqued my curiosity and got me interested again. And this is what has been my deep dive into wrestling now, is like the storytelling in wrestling. And so for me, kayfabe is a wrestling carny term that refers to the language of wrestling and sort of the storytelling of wrestling. And in a nutshell, I would say that's how I would explain our use of kayfabe.
Right.
It's basically the word wrestlers use for their type of storytelling. And getting back to the storytelling in the ring thing, my interest in that is because Street Angel is a superhero comic, and a wrestling match is essentially a fight. And whenever those guys start talking about how do you tell a story in a fight, it's like, man, this is stuff I can use.
Totally.
In a superhero comic. So that's kind of my connection to it, and hopefully the wrestling community won't be too hard on us for co-opting some of their terminology, but it's done with love.
With the popularity of the wrestling comics show and tell that we did, seems that people kind of dig the thing, man, and a lot of people have been adding some value to that in the comment section and just pointing us in interesting directions to other wrestling comics and junk like that, man. So that's pretty fun.
We've also gotten questions about how people can support our channel.
Right.
The first and obvious one is share it lots, make everybody watch it, listen to it, subscribe, all of that. The other thing, people are asking financially how to support it. And we're still in the early days of this whole channel, but one thing we're going to do is start with some t-shirts, which probably will be coming up in the next week or two.
In the meantime, buy our books,
yes.
If you,
how do I forget that part?
We have comics that are out there. Obviously, support your local comic shops first and foremost. But if we're sold out at the shop, or you just don't have easy access to a comic shop, then Amazon or some sort of online purchase is a way to go. There are links to our Amazon author page down below. But once again, want to stress support your local comic shop first and foremost.
So, we do invite you to send in questions you have for us. You can post them in the comments below. You can email us at cartoonist.kayfabe@gmail.com. Noel Freebert emailed us, what are your processes of editing? At what stage are you doing the most editing? In On Writing, Stephen King describes making a first draft, letting the work sit for a bit, then going back and taking out everything that is not the story. In cartooning, it seems insane to do that much backtracking, especially with deadlines and projects that span the course of a few issues. What projects have each of you had to edit the most? So any thoughts on editing, Ed? Because I actually met my editor at Little Brown 2 weeks ago in France, and we talked about how do you edit comics. It is a struggle. So how do you edit your own comics?
My comics are liquid up until the very end, man. They don't have their definitive shape until my editor hits me up and is like, oh, okay, it's time to go, man. We're going to hit the print button. So I'm editing at every single stage. With my next work, it's so funny that he mentioned that On Writing thing, because I mentioned earlier that I was gave that a re-listen to over the past couple of weeks. And one of the things that I really latched onto was that idea of coming up with the manuscript, putting it away for a while. In fact, start another story and then pick up that original thing once again. If we didn't do it on a kayfabe, it'll be on one of the Wizard episodes where I showed off my script process, where I basically just draw the comic in a very quick and dirty fashion on typing paper, and I'm going to do that for my next thing, and then I'm going to start another thing, and I'm just going to let that little manuscript kind of sit there And then while I write my second comic, it'll still be kind of in the back of my mind a little bit. And then I'll be able to go back and refashion that thing, reshape it, and make it even tighter. The suggestion that Stephen King makes for why you do that is because, if you're on, you just finished your story, all the toil that you just put into the project, it's all still fresh in your mind. So you feel like you climbed this goddamn mountain that your homeboy climbed. So you have to put that part of the process out of your mind for some time, so that when you go back and you reread the material, you can be a little bit harder on yourself and accept that this scene that you really love might not be necessary for the final iteration.
It is hard to gain that fresh perspective, and time is one of the great ways to do it. I had somebody tell me one time they smoke pot whenever they edit, because it puts them in a different state of mind, and it surprised me. I won't name his name, but you would be surprised too. So that is what you're trying to do, is how do I see this stuff? Because it's impossible to see it the way a reader does, obviously. You just know it too well. But having some distance, you will forget some of that details, and whenever you go back to it, you can be a little more critical. I like that advice. I tend to think of this stuff as drafts. Like you say, it's liquid until you send it to the printer, really. And it sounds like you don't work closely with an editor. I haven't either, for the most part. So I have a writing partner who's sort of an editor, and that's a big part. Sometimes we read scripts out loud. We definitely fight about everything. So that is that other perspective. And then we write as prose. So we just write a short story. Prose P-R-O-S-E, not like we're professionals. And I do that so I can see all the structure. I'm not worried about making this work as comics. I'm worried about it working as a story. And then once we have that, I take it and turn it into a comic. So each of those is a draft, and each one is editing, in my opinion, going from that draft to the next. And I've done, I did a zine that I called Process Pack that showed several of my drafts, roughs, script, pencils, finished piece, and you'll see changes at every stage. That's a big part. Having a few people that I trust, that I can actually put something in front of them and be read this, and let me ask you some questions, or tell me if there's something that doesn't make sense as part of it.
I'm so glad you brought up the thing about working with the editor, because fuck it, I'll name drop. You and I had an awesome dinner with Howard Chaykin, and he looked at both of us and said, "You guys should have an editor."
Yeah. I don't know how well he knows our work, but he was like, "You need an editor." It's whoa.
And we had a pretty long conversation with him about hiring freelance editors and who will give you fresh eyes and aren't your friends who feel any sort of notion of giving it to you lightly.
Right.
So I'm actually going to take him up on that, I think, and get a hold of his guy and drop a couple of little dollars to get some professional fresh eyes.
Going back to Noel's original question, it is rigorous and hard to edit comics, and I think that's what the drafts allow. I think a lot of the traditional New York publishers that have gotten into graphic novels, they require those drafts. They want to see the layouts. Something that would be different, I think, than, say, Marvel in the past. I think now that's probably changed and they've caught up too, but whenever it was churning out a book every month, guys weren't turning in layouts to get approved. You know what I mean? It was you were trying to just get the pages in before they had to use the fill-in issue. I think that's something that's changed, but those drafts do make the editing a little bit easier, or a little bit more possible. I've done stuff where I'll do scenes on index cards because it's so easy to edit. You can kind of draw a few of them, lay them out, see what's missing, or see what doesn't work, pull it out, redo it, and it's very easy to rearrange and change. So for editing is a challenge. All of these steps are just trying to get that plan in place for whenever you're doing the finished art.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything, man. I think that corresponds with the famous Dan Clowes, Jim Woodring extra 5%. The idea that if you do 5% more than what everybody else does, you will have a pretty solid piece of work under your belt.
Jeff Smith, you're saying Dan Clowes made me think of this, but Jeff Smith talked about how he would change, each printing of these books. Go in and fix a couple of things that bother you, or something that you caught this time.
That's on the conversation that Jim had on the Image podcast.
And I've read interviews with Dan Clowes where he talks about that, going, especially these guys who will serialize their work and then they do a collection. It is a chance to fix the stuff that you noticed after the fact.
the keen-eyed Ed Piskor reader will definitely see differences between the issues of X-Men Grand Design and the stuff in the trade paperback. What do you say, Jim? I think that's a pretty good enough place to leave this gimmick.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Without further ado, I'm Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And we're going to go back to making some comics, but make sure that you read more comics.